Hey guys, how's it going? Kevin Cleary here with a knife video for you. Today we are looking at a couple of modern classics. These are both large, heavy-duty, hard-use knives. They're long time competitors, and so we want to ask the question, which one is the best for your cutting needs? All right, so first let me say that the comments here are going to be somewhat applicable in general. That is, various versions of these two knives. However, an important point to make is that the Adamas in the Cruewear version has slightly thinner edge geometry. And I don't know that that's just true of every more modern Adamas or if it's just true of the Cruewear. So keep that in the back of your minds. If you're looking at an older D2 Adamas, for sure, it's going to have thicker edge geometry, which for me is a big hit on performance. I've had the older one and I actually didn't like it because it was just too thick behind the edge. All right, having gotten that out of the way, otherwise you should be able to take most of these comments and apply them fairly generally. Okay, so the first thing to point out is these are very similar in size. Overall size on both of these is just under 9 inches. The Manix comes in at just slightly larger at 8 15/16, while the Adamas is 8 7/8. All right, blade length on the Manix is going to be 3 7/8. Blade length on the Adamas is 3 3/4. So if you're noticing here, these are like within a 1/16 of each other overall. They're within an 1/8 of each other on blade length. All right, cutting edge is going to be 3 1/2 inches on the Adamas. Well, it's going to be 3 7/8 on the Adamas. So notice the extra cutting edge you're getting. All right, that is notable. Okay, we'll come back and talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the blade specifically, but just want to make sure you're getting that. Closed, the Manix is 5 1/8, and the Adamas is 5 3/16. So again, within a 1/16 of an inch of each other. All right, grip area on the Manix. Now this is going to be one of the major differences. Grip area on the Manix is 3 3/4 in this specific area where your fingers kind of drop in. And then of course there's that Spidernomics. So you've got that room for a choked up position, which you're not going to see on the Adamas. Now, then as we balance this out, the grip area on the Adamas is larger, all right, at 4 1/4. So almost a full 1/2 inch. Let's do this little comparison again. So notice how much shorter this is than this. So if you have huge hands, then the Adamas might be your better bet right off the hop. All right, otherwise, this is something I always recommend. If you're really torn between two different knives, do your best to get both of them in hand. I know, depending on where you live, like honestly, I'll tell you right now, where I live, if I wanted to go to a brick and mortar store and get a full-size Adamas in hand, or actually a full-size Manix 2 XL, I think the closest place that I can think of is about a 2-hour drive away. So I understand that's not always practical. Maybe you got a friend, or maybe you've got some other option, or maybe you've just gotten so used to buying knives that you know exactly what grip area works best for you. All right, now back to our last point in terms of size and weight comparison, and that is the weight is going to be quite different on these two, as is the width. So if I close these down and put them back to back, you can see a significant difference in the thickness of these handles. Okay, so the Adamas is much thicker and therefore much more noticeable in pocket. Just to give you an idea there, under 1/2 inch for the Manix 2 XL, about 7/16, and at least 5/8, and I might be giving you, it's about 5/8 there by the time you account for the contoured G10 on the Adamas. All right, so that's one thing to be aware of. The other big thing to be aware of here is the weight. The Manix for a large knife is pretty good. It comes in at 4.8 ounces, which is excellent. The Adamas is going to be 6.4 ounces. So if you're one of these people that really, really cares about size and weight, you're probably carrying a bug out anyway. But if you care and you still want something a little bit larger, that's where those numbers might come into play for you. All right, just to give you an idea, the Recon 1 weighs like 5 ounces. So that's a pretty good sort of middle of the road comparison. Now, having gotten the size and weight out of the way, let's talk about these blades. First, here we have the PVD coated Cruewear on the Adamas. Now, that coating is nice because Cruewear is not a super stainless steel. It's going to, in fact, it's not a stainless steel. It's going to corrode. It's going to take a patina. I live, thankfully, in a pretty dry environment, so I've had this Manix for a while now. I do take a little bit of care of it. I try to put a little bit of oil on it, but I don't go crazy, and I only kind of do it when I really think about it. But as you can see, both of these in my environment have held up pretty well. Now, if you're watching this in Florida or, I mean, even Tennessee or, you know, Washington State or Vancouver, British Columbia, you know, where you have these high humidities that are there almost all year round, you're going to have to pay more attention to corrosion resistance than somebody watching in, you know, I don't know, Colorado where the humidity is like 0 half the time. Okay, so be aware, and probably if you're watching this and you're this interested in knives, you probably have a pretty good sense for whether or not you can get away with non-stainless steels very easily where you live or not. All right, now, well, it's not stainless. The reason people love Cruewear so much is because its performance is very good. So it's pretty good on edge retention, and it's excellent on toughness. So toughness means like resistance to fracturing, at least according to knife steel nerds. And so that means these are blades that are not likely to break or chip on you. They're going to hold up even under some pretty hard use type of scenarios. Now, I always feel like I have to say this when I'm talking about a folding knife. This is still a folding knife. There are certain things you should not be doing with it, where if you're gonna really put a whole lot of stress or strain on that blade steel, you ought to switch to a fixed blade where you don't have it, you know, designed with a pivot in the middle that makes it inherently weaker. Okay, but given that we allow for that qualification, Cruewear is going to stand up to tougher use than various comparable steels. All right. Now, as has often been pointed out, there's a trade-off with everything, and the trade-off with the Cruewear is the edge retention is good, but it's not amazing. This is not Rex 121. This is not Maximet. This is not, in fact, it's not even MagnaCut. So keep that in the back of your mind as you're thinking about your use case, all right? But for someone like me who likes to be confident that they can get away with a lot of things with their knife, they're sort of ready for anything, these are both really good the examples of Cruewear steel. Now, what about the specific design behind each blade? As you can see, all right, they're designed slightly differently, with the Adamas being a bit thicker, with it carrying more of that thickness out toward the tip of the knife. So out of these two blades, from a design standpoint, from you know, what are these going to hold up to? This one is going to be the tougher of the two. This one is going to be the slicier of the two, just given the grind and the overall size. I've talked recently in a video about how that all plays out, and on certain things it doesn't make that much of a difference, and in other areas it will make more of a difference. I'm going to give you just a quick, both of these, by the way, are very sharp, and I actually find that Cruewear is not that bad to sharpen, and it holds that edge pretty nicely, and that's another reason people love Cruewear. I don't know if you're like me, but I don't, you know, I prefer if I can get steel that's pretty easy to sharpen and then almost impossible to dull. That doesn't exist really, although XHP does a great job. But I do want to just point out that this is a testing medium I use quite a bit because I can sort of feel and see. So a knife that I have to really push on, as you can see here, you know, when I get a little more deformation of the circle, And so here's a perfect example. So I'm pushing about equally hard, but this has cut in more than this. And that's just because there's so much less material on the Spyderco. With a little bit of movement, the Adamas really does fall through this material. And just to give you an idea, what's really happening here is I just have to push less on the Manix to do the same job. As you can see, they'll both do it, but the Manix is going to slice a little bit better. The other thing you're going to notice, and this is a general truism, thicker edged knives, when they get dull, it's more noticeable. A very thin edge with a very high secondary bevel is going to, even if it gets a little bit dull, it's going to perform better. So that's something to keep in mind, especially if you're, someone who's thinking, well, long term, what if my knife does get a little dull and I still need it to work? That's where the Manix is going to win out in this comparison. If, on the other hand, for some reason you're always stabbing this in and bending it around, I don't know, you're prying grubs out of logs that you're gonna, I don't know, use for bait or something, maybe in that case you want to lean toward the thicker blade stock and the slightly more robust blade. Again, both of these are going to be very tough. The Adamas is going to be a little tougher. The Spyderco is going to be a little slicier. Again, both work pretty well, but for cutting performance, you're probably going to lean a little bit toward the Spyderco. By the way, I should back up a little bit. I didn't declare a winner in terms of size and weight. And I really need to point out that the Manix 2 XL does a better job. It comes in at such a lower weight, but there's going to be a trade-off later, which is why I didn't draw a firm conclusion there. So in terms of comfort of carry, yeah, the Manix is an easy pick. In terms of blade, it really depends on what you're looking for, but the Spyderco to me is a little bit better, although just a little bit. And as you cut with these two, you notice that the difference is so small that perhaps in your mind, it's better because it's almost no sacrifice to go for the tougher blade. And that totally makes sense to me, as well as a little extra cutting edge, okay? That's the last point I want to make here. In comparing the cutting edge, well, the Spyderco has less. The Benchmade does have the pocket clip taking up a little bit of the edge there when you're really trying to reach, cutting a pineapple or a large tomato or something like that. When reach really matters, you lose just a little bit of reach because of that thumb stud, where you don't lose it with the Manix because there's no thumb stud in the way. In terms of sharpening, I've sharpened both of these. I've touched them up really. They both came very sharp to me, but neither one had issues with any interference with the edge from either the handle or the thumb studs. All right, so pretty interesting comparison. This makes for an interesting discussion because the steel is the same. So anytime we can equalize some variables, we can get more meaningful results. And the meaningful result here is there is a slight difference in cutting performance in these two blade shapes, even though the steel is exactly the same. Now, it's a pretty obvious difference. I think most of you watching could look at these two blades and draw those conclusions yourselves. All right, let's talk about the action, lockup and deployment on these. The Benchmade is, of course, using the Benchmade axis lock. And the other reason this is an interesting comparison is because Spyderco's sort of answer to the axis lock is the bearing lock. And so I will say this, the spring tension is much higher on the Manix. All right, you're definitely going to notice that. The detent is a little snappier because of that extra spring tension. And of course, the Manix is using a coil spring, and I think you can actually see a couple of the coils there, rather than the Omega spring, which you can't see at all on the Benchmade, maybe. I guess you can see a little bit of the back of the spring right there, if I get the light just right. Nah, I don't think you're going to show up on, there you go. You can just see a little bit of the edge of it. Now, there have definitely been complaints about breaking Omega springs on Benchmades. And then when they do break, it can be a little bit of a pain in the neck to replace those because Benchmade has traditionally not been super happy to just send out unlimited numbers of Omega springs. I want to say they've gotten a little better on that. It's been a while since I conversed with Benchmade. A number of years ago, I got a replacement clip for a Benchmade, and that was no problem. They just sent it right out. In fact, they sent it out in a different coating than original. because I requested that. I haven't requested Omega Springs in a while, so someone please fill in the comments. The problem with that is if you're in the field or if you're in a situation where you really need your knife and an Omega Spring breaks, that's a big pain in the neck, all right? And potentially is going to impact the function of the knife to some degree, all right? And so we need to make mention of the difference in reliability here. The coil spring is pretty reliable compared to, I mean, all springs can wear out and break, I suppose, but the Omega springs have more of a reputation for doing that, and that makes sense given the single piece of metal that you're relying on. The next thing we need to touch on is both of these are on washers. They are not on roller bearings, and yet both of them have pretty darn good action. The Manix is a little tighter, and that's mostly because of my preference. I don't like any blade play at all. The Benchmade has worn in enough that it's rock solid, but still opens and closes pretty comfortably and pretty quickly. All right. In terms of which one's easier, absolutely the Benchmade. I can do this with one finger without a problem. The Manix, if you try to do the one finger thing, you can do it, but you really got to pay attention to what you're doing. What I find myself mostly doing is putting this into the fat of my hand. And this is a common, I think I'm about the 1,000th reviewer to say that's how they usually use the bearing lock on a Manix of some version, and that's including this one here. All right, so lockup and deployment, both are good. The Benchmade is a little easier ergonomically. The Spyderco is a little more reliable in terms of the lock. So which one wins in this case? I guess the Spyderco wins for reliability and the Benchmade wins for ease of use. All right, that's really, again, they're much like the blade discussion, they're very close. All right, let's move on though to ergonomics, which is another big consideration with a knife like this. One of the things I think is critical to a hard use knife is that I can put hard use on it and it still feels okay in hand. And so to demonstrate that, I'm using a piece of wood anyway. So this is a test I frequently do. I just grab the knife and try in a few different configurations to push down really hard and see which is more comfortable. All right, and so what I will tell you is that there is a noticeable difference in the Adamas versus the Manix in a hammer grip. All right, in a hammer grip, the Manix is not quite as good as the Benchmade. In a saber grip, though, that's where the Manix does shine a little bit more. First, the location of the thumb ramp here pushes me back on the handle a little bit, making it not quite as comfortable, where the Manix, it's like it was designed for this grip. The other thing is the Manix has this choke up position, which allows me to get up on the knife a little bit if ever I need to do that. So ergonomics overall, I have to give to the Benchmade, but in specific grips, the Spyderco does jump ahead just a little. All right, so overall, if I had to pick one of these and get rid of one, which would it be? This would be a really hard pick. I'm trying to put myself in a scenario where I don't have, in addition to these two hard use knives, I have like a bunch of others. All right, so when it comes to something that's reliable that I can get away with carrying in the woods and knowing that I can get some real work done, I have a number of knives that could fill this role, and I'm not interested in getting rid of any of them. All right, for my use case, I would probably just slightly lean to the Spyderco. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, it is a little easier to carry. So for an EDC knife, which is how I use most of my, I don't only get my hard use knives out when I know I'm like going out into the woods to survive. I carry these as EDC knives. And so from that perspective, the Manix is definitely a winner because it's much lighter and much thinner in pocket. All right. The other thing is I go out of my way to carry an EDC, even EDC, a small fixed blade quite often. And so if I really want something crazy overbuilt that I can absolutely beat on, I'm going to be carrying, my Line Steel M4, or something of that nature so that I don't really have to make super duper hard use a major consideration for my choices. And often I'll carry a fixed blade and a pretty big heavy duty EDC. All right, so as I said, for me, the Spyderco just edges out the Benchmade by a little. However, I love both of these and I have no intention of getting rid of either one of them because I can imagine a time where I'd want something a little more robust in terms of blade grind. And in that case, I may lean over to the Benchmade or, I mean, any number of other hard-use knives that I have and enjoy in my collection. And by the way, it's not lost on me how fortunate I am to own a number of really, really great knives. Thanks a lot for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll talk to you soon.